Today's topic is the impact of sociopolitical disruption on diverse populations. Our time is marked by profound and rapid social change in almost every sector and every institutional sphere. And one way to anticipate the consequences of this rapid social change is in the context of what Klaus Schwab calls the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This Fourth Industrial Revolution involves the fusion of various technologies, the emergence of various production systems, as well as the convergence of capabilities in pursuit of our varied social goals. Many of us view these advances as having great promise, at the same time that they give us cause for concern. Former presidential candidate Andrew Yang has warned us of the imminent effects that this fourth industrial revolution will have on communities of color. And the COVID-19 pandemic has made these concerns even more urgent. In many ways, the socioeconomic disparities that continue to plague our society have been magnified as a result of the economic and sociopolitical disruptions we have witnessed in 2020. In today's conversation, we will focus on how professionals, industry leaders, and educators can respond to the changing needs of diverse populations in the midst of this pandemic, mounting socioeconomic pressure, and the digital transformation that is already underway. Now, I would like to welcome our panelists. We are very grateful for your presence here today. We are excited to learn from your diverse experiences and the unique perspectives you will bring to this topic. First, I would like to introduce Dia Khanna, Global Diversity and Inclusion Program Manager at Amazon.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm very excited to share my perspectives. I especially lead with a global lens, and I'm just grateful to the SPU community for inviting me. Thank you.
Next, we have Arturo Ortiz, Principal Software Engineering Manager at Cloud Plus AI at Microsoft.
Thank you, Raphael, and thank you to the SPU community for having me. I'm very excited to learn my experiences with diversity and inclusion and how they actually result in innovation for technology products. Thanks.
Thank you, Arturo, and welcome. Next, we have Michael Cato, Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Bowdoin College.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Raphael. I look forward to the conversation today. I'll be speaking from the lens of working in higher education, both with my experiences with students, faculty, and staff, and also thinking about how we recruit and develop diverse teams.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we have Gloria Kimbwala, CEO and founder of Bisalu.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm so thankful to be on this panel and to have this discussion. I'm coming from a lens of disruptive technologies and distributed organizations, as well as authentic selves and bringing that to the workplace. So I'm happy to start talking.
Thank you. And finally, we have Dr. ClarLynda Willams-DeVane, Director of the State Center for Health Statistics at the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services.
Thanks, Raphael, for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. I'll be speaking from two different lenses. The first as a former chair of data science and bioinformatics, thinking about preparing a diverse workforce, and now as the director of the State Center for Health Statistics for North Carolina and thinking about how we transform data to really focus on health equity and taking care of our vulnerable populations.
Thank you. To the audience, we will have some Q&A, so please remember to ask questions as we proceed and vote up questions you would like to be addressed. And we will do our best to incorporate them in the conversation or try to address them at the end. I would like to begin our discussion by asking our panelists to think about what diversity and inclusion mean to them. Specifically, what do diversity and inclusion mean to you in the context of your work in the field of expertise? And what is one way that the sociopolitical events of this year have either reinforced or challenged your views on diversity and inclusion as they pertain to your work? And anyone can feel free to answer it first, or I can do it in order, but not everyone needs to share on every question. So anyone who feels like sharing first is welcome to.
Hi, it's Dia. I'm happy to go first, just to kick off the conversation. But diversity is really just a range of human differences. So we think about who's on this call, who's participating in this conversation. We have diversity, and inclusion is bringing those differences to tables of influence and feeling like they really belong. And equity is when we have fair treatment, and that is taking into account the differences, historical context, and what we can put in place to make sure that everybody is treated fairly and justly. And what's interesting in the context of this year in particular, what's arisen for me is how important the intersectionality of our identities are. So really the framework that we're not just one identity, we are compounding identities, and how that plays out in the context of what's happening in 2020. And also the global perspective. It's the realization that diversity goes beyond the US. It goes to the far reaches of all over the world. And we really look at different marginalized groups and how they're being impacted. We can see that what COVID, for example, has done has amplified what has been happening for a long time, which is the difference between people who have accessibility and people who have different levels of accessibility. So I think it's really amplifying the complexity of these conversations, not just, oh, we have differences, but how are these identities playing out in a wider socio-political context?
Yeah. I would like to speak for a moment. I think when I start to think of this current socio-political current social political scenario that we're in, I actually have to go back to the day after the election for me specifically, where our workplace had many different people from many different backgrounds coming in and talking about what their fears were and what the change really meant to them. And it was them based on their religion, their immigration status, the sexual orientation. Everybody had concerns at that time, and they've just been amplified even to now. But for me, when I start to think about our current social political time, I was one of the persons who in my neighborhood was organizing Black Lives Matter marches after George Floyd's death, and was at the other end of sniper guns from militia groups. And then the next day went to work like it was absolutely nothing. And it made me realize that every single day people face literally life and death choices out on their streets after they go to work, and then they come to work, and whether they share that with their colleagues or not, it's really just an additional weight that really prevents them from bringing their whole selves and being productive. And so when I think of diversity and inclusion, I actually think of belonging, and like, is your workplace a place where people can be their whole selves authentically, where they feel that they can belong, where they don't feel like they're going to be continually traumatized beyond the outside world and then come in and be outside and further that traumatization. And I think that in our current social political stance, where people are distance and we really don't get to check in on everyone in that type of way, we really have to be cognizant that people are bringing more to the workplace. They're bringing their ideas, they're bringing all of those, but there's things that happen at home. And so we just have to be humane in the way that we treat each other and really be cognizant that we're not all coming from the same place. And that's extremely important to me.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. And we're happy to hear it because this question is so broad. We would love to hear from the other members of the panel on that as well. And what
if I may, Raphael, there are a couple of things that came to mind. And Arturo, you referenced this already, that diverse teams how they lead to innovation, right? I know I'm looking forward to getting to that specifically. So as we come through this current cycle, it's one of the places where I can see examples of organizations that just have not appreciated just how helpful that could be, right? One of mine was this morning, when I listened to the coverage of last night's vice presidential debate. I was struck by the difference in how the commentators would talk about it, if it was an all male group or if there was gender diversity in the group. Once there was gender diversity, they were able to talk about the power dynamics that showed up in who was willing to talk over whom. But if it was just a group of men, they jumped right to the fly and the things that were just a lot more surface level for me. And I was struck by how absent that was. And it's only when you have, you can gain a real appreciation of how different people can experience the same situation differently. I think you have a real opportunity to surface that when you have much more, not just diverse teams, but I really appreciate that description, Dia. You have to have inclusion and equity if you're really going to pursue it.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. I believe ClarLynda was about to speak as well.
Yes, I think diversity and inclusion, particularly when we think about health equity, is so important to think about everyone having a seat at the table, but also training enough of our citizens and students and academians to fill that seat. And I think the complexity of what's going on in 2020 really requires us to think outside of the bounds of just defining diversity by gender or sex or race or ethnicity, but also starting to think about culture and the opportunities and experiences that people have, and making sure that that's how we think about forming our teams, as opposed to these sort of standard metrics that no longer matter in 2020.
Thank
Just
you.
want to add quickly to what everyone said. I think we already talked about race and gender and so on. I think Dia started us off in a really good direction of like human differences, and I just want to call out two that we haven't really talked about yet, which is sexual orientation, in particular like the LGBTQ community, and also people with disabilities. And something that I learned in recent years is that actually most disabilities are not visible to the naked eye. When we think about disabilities, we usually, think about someone maybe with blindness, or maybe someone who depends on a wheelchair, for example. But there's so many disabilities that are not obvious. For example, color blindness, dyslexia, anxiety and depression, and many, many more. That also, I think we have to keep in mind, acknowledge, and also try to include into our industries, right? And benefit from those perspectives too, and those different capabilities too.
Thank you, Arturo, and thank you, ClarLynda, and thanks to everyone for sharing on this question. I think it's such a crucial question in terms of how you think about diversity and incorporate it in your work, and how you see it sort of manifests itself in your space, in your everyday practices. And we have a question actually from Aurelio. And the question is, how do you balance your own personal sovereignty, but also the needs of everyone you are serving in the context of the pursuing equity, inclusion, and diversity?
I think that's where it becomes important to really form a team that has diversity, that can call out the areas, that the gaps in equity and why it is occurring. But when we have a team where everyone looks the same, everyone's perspective is the same. And so you're likely not to have a person who recognizes that there is that gap in equity. So it's really important to make sure, as we're thinking about forming these diverse teams and the inclusion that we have, that we allow people to be empowered to call out what's missing and where the gaps are, without retribution, but they can all be heard.
I think it goes back to a point, Gloria, that you made, that the idea of taking care of yourself, right? I think about the good old days when we used to fly more often, right? And those early instructions about the mask, the first thing they tell you is to put yours on first before you help your loved ones. I think we have to take that same attitude here. There's nothing wrong with making sure that you've taken care of yourself. And if that experience the day before was significant to you, was traumatic, figuring out how do you create that space for yourself before you're trying to contribute for others.
Well put. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, ClarLynda, for these insights. That is so very true. Taking care of oneself is so crucial. Yeah, and I think sometimes we don't think about that enough. We think of being a hero and just jumping in and trying to make accommodations and make space for others, which is important. But I think self-care, especially now, is so important. There's something Arturo said earlier that I would like to go back to in talking about these various layers, such as gender, race, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation. And he said something about things that are not covert, things that are not visible, right? Could you speak on that, or anyone else? Could you speak on that again? And also in terms of the intersectionalities of these different layers and how they sort of overlap to make things more complex in terms of opportunities, in terms of both on the hiring and in retention, and sort of finding your place to work and also at work.
Yeah, it's a very, very complex topic. One very simple approach is just from the lens of building better products, like better software products specifically, which is what I do. When you think about color blindness, it's things like when you design user interfaces, thinking about which colors to use, even like which shapes, the size of those shapes, like a button, for example, right? Because there are different capabilities, and what might seem simple for some person, like just click on this little button, it might be really hard for other people. So just thinking from the lens of how to build better products, like these are great exercises. But also when leading a team that have people with different capabilities and different strengths, it really makes you kind of think about your own assumptions and your own expectations, and really it forces you to be more open-minded about how a team can be high performant, and leveraging those differences rather than seeing them as an obstacle, right? And for example, something like even right now with COVID, having children just presents challenges at home, right? Trying to juggle childcare and working from home, right? And things that we've done in the past, for example, is, hey, for some people, different schedules work better than others. So then can we leverage that as a strength so that we have, someone working on something 24 hours, almost like around the clock, right? But it's a very, very complex topic, and it depends on the capabilities that we're talking about, right? So something that I've learned is just to keep learning and more about different capabilities, reaching out to different communities, and just educating myself on the differences, the challenges that people go through, so that I can be a better leader and also build better products.
Thank you.
If I may just add one thing, I was hearing you talk, Arturo, and one thing that I was thinking is tactically, one way to do this is to collect not only quantitative data, but also qualitative data in the form of anecdotes and stories. And like you said, really listening to communities. And one great example is yesterday after the debate, there was a lot of chatter among women of color and Black women saying there has been that feeling of being interrupted, and you don't necessarily need to rely on solely the quantitative data to realize that this is a topic that is at the forefront of people's minds. So I think it's really honoring that what communities are saying in their own words, perhaps in town halls or in affinity groups or employee resource groups, or in their own communities, is equally as valid as what we're collecting numerically and data-wise.
I think the other side that we that I really try to keep in top of mind when we're dealing with communities is that just that it's not the community's responsibility to educate us. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves in dealing with the whole perspectives. And so when I have my team that comes from a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different thoughts, I always amplify them for the work that they're doing. And if they happen to share or send feedback or a tidbit, we're grateful for it. But then we go on from there and learn about it more upon ourselves and realize that they are the expert in the communities that they are from, but in no way is it their responsibility to teach us. It is my responsibility as a founder of an organization to take the feedback that I'm getting and move forward with it and make the right decisions.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's, sorry, if I can, that's such a powerful point, Gloria, that seeking the feedback in the first place, which feels like that's something that's often missing, right? We make the decisions made and then announced versus, here's what we're trying to do. And this happens in so many different levels that you often miss the opportunity to get that feedback that would allow you to make better decisions.
Thank you. I very much like the idea of the insiders being experts in their community and sort of tapping into that as a resource, because that's what they are. They're resources, right? They're very resourceful people. And I think they can be bridges between whatever space we are navigating and those communities as well, if we sort of tap into it. We have a question from Kirsten. And the question is, in addition to accessibility, what does prior trauma, discrimination, and or allostatic load have to do with COVID impacting populations differently? And by allostatic load, I'm guessing Kirsten means the usual wear and tear, sort of, the everyday wear and tear while you're on the job and getting your way through.
I think that early in COVID, when we started to say like, well, everyone can just work from home and everyone can just go to school from home, there was this underlying assumption that people had equal, Wi-Fi accessibility, they had equal access to technology. Yet for decades, we've known that there's been this great digital divide that has impacted people socioeconomically, but also on racial sides as well. And so you're seeing this from that perspective. Holistically, when we deal with different types of industries that just, happen to have higher rates of like suicide or mental health issues, and then now they're impacted by having all these additional stresses, there are just different ways where we have to look at the decisions that leaders are making about their workforces. And so for me, when COVID hit, we just said, okay, this is an immensely intense time. I had worked from home and tried to homeschool a child before. If we can just be as decrease our expectations of productivity until we can kind of ride this out a little bit more, that would be helpful. And if we can like really solve some core solutions to this, that would be even more impactful. So it's really revealing a lot about the way leaders think people are and some of those underlining biases that are coming in. And really, it's really important that people advocate for people in marginalized groups and bring their expertise to the front doors, so that if like this decision is going to impact, people in a way that is not impactful for everybody else, and that is more important. So yeah, that's one of the ways I can think top of the head. The other side is like community. Some people are extreme community people, and they're making some very difficult decisions right now in their home life that maybe they don't feel like discussing in their work life. But, you have to see that a lot of people are really weighing heavily with a lot of difficult choices, especially when we start to go through the holidays, where usually it's people gathering, people, dealing with that. So that's one side of it. And then you see the breakdown from COVID, who's really getting impactful, some of those, core essential workers, how that's breaking down to it. So there's a lot of different fallouts from COVID. COVID, is a pandemic, but there's also the social economic part that we're dealing with. There's the educational part. There is the economic part from, a whole amount of people being laid off. And so there's all these undermining issues that are also falling through on different racial lines that we just have to be, or different, actually different types of lines, whether it's race, socioeconomic, gender, there's a lot of different ways. And then you have to think of the historic trauma, where a solution that's being saying is going to be provided has a historical impact into different communities that might not be more inept to participate in different types of solutions that are being proposed. So we really have to look at it and say, like, not everyone's going to be on board and think it's going to be a hooray right off of the bat. But they're bringing their lens to it and really listen to why they're concerned and things of that nature. And I think that will allow us to make a better solution.
Thank you, Gloria. You touched on a lot here. You touched on essential workers and the proportion of them that are in minority groups, marginalized populations. You touched also on digital inequities, which we really want to talk about today as well. And in the context of digital inequities, I mean, we saw a trend for decades now, and especially right before COVID hit, we sort of knew that people in certain segments of the population, especially those who were making less than $30,000, for example, were living in rural areas, or were working in specific sorts of jobs, really didn't have access to broadband. Right. And actually a Pew Research Center study from 2019 found that 40% of schools outside of metropolitan areas didn't have access to broadband. And 60% of healthcare facilities didn't have broadband outside of metropolitan areas. So how do you anticipate that these digital inequities will really shape the future of work? And we can speak to this in the context of the people who recently graduated, for example, from a school like SPU or elsewhere. And also in the context of people who will graduate soon, right? And how that works for them as well. What is the importance of those gaps in access to those services, especially the internet?
So I think education showed the first microscope of or magnification of how this impact is, because traditionally when you looked at education, you had schools that excelled and already had e-learning in place, and they already were using a lot of technology in the classroom. And then you had other schools that were still using a traditional model with the lecturer and paper and pens. And when COVID happened and everyone said, okay, we're just gonna learn from home, the adaptation rate to e-learning was so much easier for those who are already exposed to it than it was for those who had no exposure to it, whose teachers had never had to put lectures online, and that had a very difficult ramp up for that. The other side of it was some of the normal technology, or not more traditional, new technologies like the Zoom, the Slack, the Google Docs. Some of that was people were exposed to already in school. So then now when they're going to the workplace, they're traditionally utilizing it, that they already had access and they can kind of onboard a little bit quicker. But if you came from an area that maybe did not have the access to the e-learning, did not have online, facilitations of communications, your onboarding, your ramp up, your change to those new technologies were extremely difficult. And we're seeing a lot of companies solely being able to thrive right now by mastering digital technologies. And so for me, it was looking at traditionally these schools who tend to be in more fluid populations that had to follow along racial divide lines. They were more amped to have some jobs because of the historical aspect of being able to come onto e-learning, learning the new technologies, having teachers that were able to teach on e-learning platforms. That transition was a lot easier. And then they were able to carry the technologies that they had learned into the digital spaces and into the workspaces that were also relying on these same type of technologies. But when you had students and then now have to go into workplaces that are totally digitalized, not only does the company have an onboarding issue, these new way of working, but you also had students that had to get used to the technology. And so it wasn't that there was an inequality of talent or an inequality of thought or ability, but it was really just who had more understanding to the technology. And if you had two students start at the same time and one student was coming from that model, another student had the traditional model, and then you're going to evaluate them, at 3 months or 6 months and say, wow, you're not you're not doing as well as your peers and during this transition, it's really a question that as leaders have to ask and say, well, was there a reason systematically that students that are coming from the traditional models are, and what can we do to empower students that were still in those traditional models and bring them this way? And so yes, it is, broadband. Yes, it's access to personal laptops. It's access to, did they have, were they the only person in the house that knows the technology and has to be that person for everybody else? Or is there someone else that they were able to learn? And now that we're not learning like together as cohorts, like in person, maybe that was that person's learning style. And so there's a lot of adaptation that has to happen. And I think that now as we go towards 6 months to 9 months to a year, we really have to think about how do we evaluate people? And was it like a person's inept, or is it actually the organization and their onboarding for the non-traditional ways that really could have been the main impact? And I always believe that once you hire a person for the job, you believe in them, you say, yes, they can do it. The rest of it is onboarding. It's the responsibility of the organization of, did you do what you promised on your end of the bargain to make sure that they were going to be the most successful person?
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you for clarifying that for us. I think you've unpacked quite a bit. And because we're on the topic of education, we have a great question from Paul from our audience. Paul, the question goes like this. I would like to propose that an undergraduate degree is the new minimum requirement for obtaining most living wage jobs in this new economy in the context of the fourth industrial revolution. Given that higher education has historically not been accessible for historically underrepresented populations, how do you recommend an institution like SPU move towards progress in this regard? And anyone is welcome to sort of tackle this one. This is a big question. Thank you, Paul, for asking this brilliant question.
I'd like to start from the perspective of someone who's in higher ed, but I'm really curious to also ask, particularly for the panelists who are outside higher ed, who are working in corporate settings, because I would gently and kindly question the premise of the question, because I do believe that that is the perspective that many institutions hold, that an undergraduate degree is now the new minimum. But I think that assumption is being challenged and being increasingly challenged as more and more companies realize that that degree meant something to them. And if they can unpack what it meant, and that there are other ways that they can clarify candidates who can represent those things, then certifications, demonstrating work could be things that become equally, maybe we don't start off it becomes equally as useful or as measurable, but it definitely becomes an open door for someone to get into those positions. And I say that as someone who spent 20 years working in higher education, right? So we value our product, right? And our product are the degrees. So the way I would answer the question, the way it's framed, is I think that there are a number of institutions that have really stepped into being very aggressive about their recruiting and intentionally trying to diversify the student populations that they're bringing in. I credit a lot of liberal arts institutions for doing some really creative work, because especially those that have got the resources to be really aggressive about financial aid. Bowdoin, as I'm happy to share, is one of those institutions that's not only need blind when it comes to admissions, but we also have a no loan policy, right? So we don't use loans in calculating what a family's contribution to your ability to pay, right? So we've made decisions like that so that when students graduate from here, our goal is to drive down the amount of debt that they graduate with, right? So that they're starting off on a much better footing, and then coming from an institution with the kind of reputation that we have. But not every institution has the resources. That's a very expensive thing to do. And the larger institution, the more complicated and expensive it is. But that's the way I would answer the question, the way it's framed. But I would suggest, I'm not so sure that framing is going to hold as we move forward. And I'm really curious if our colleagues from corporate can speak to that as well.
Yeah, so before Bisalu, I had a startup that dealt with disruptive technology for decentralization of education. So I will tell you this point. I worked in higher ed for a long time, getting underrepresented minorities to college. And I also am of the thought that I'm not a big fan of degrees, just to tell you bluntly. I think so for so long we've followed this pedigree model of like, well, if you had a degree from this place, then you'll do great, but not if you had a degree from this point. And I really think that as work continues, it's going to be focused upon what you do with work and how the skill sets that you bring. I also am a parent of a gifted child. So my child is taking his first college course this summer at 11. And I think that sometimes when you start to look at the structure of how we do college, and like, especially with underrepresented groups, of like, you take these courses during high school, and then you're going to take those same type of courses at a university with more in-depth and thought, that maybe it could be beneficial if that model changed a little bit and people had more access to college level discussions or conversations earlier, and they were able to explore a little bit sooner. But from a corporate perspective, I've had interns that did not go to college, did not work in the degrees that they are currently working in, and they've been doing absolutely great. They were able to do the work. And in the model of Bisalu, what we build, there's not even a space for you to enter your college and say where you went to school. It's mostly focused on like your skill set, what do you do, who are you as a person? Because I can have a great engineer from Harvard that can't communicate and can't knowledge share and can't work as part of a team, or I can have someone who didn't graduate high school but can do the work and can communicate and can knowledge share. And during those interviews, I don't really know which back and forth who's who, but all I'm looking for is who's going to be best for the role. And the college degree doesn't infer directly that you will. There's a lot of people who are great with the degrees, and a lot of people who don't do great with it, and a lot of people who have different backgrounds than what they're applying for. And so I think the model is going to change over time based on like the work and the proof that you can do the work. And some of that can come from a college degree, but for a lot of people, it does not.
I'd be very interested to hear what ClarLynda, what you think about this, the way the question is posed and what it means to you in your career.
Yeah, I think that we are moving away from undergraduate degrees at all in data science. I believe that there will be people who have undergraduate degrees, but there's so many other very focused technical programs that allow students to get the certifications and things that they need to qualify for a position. But I think this highlights again, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, seeing the whole person and not just a degree. And so because of that, I think that this is probably not the direction that we want to move in, but we want to really begin to develop metrics that take into account the whole person and their qualification for those particular jobs.
Thank you. Thank you. Arturo, did you want to chime in?
Sure. Although I'm also really interested in hearing the yes response to this question. But I agree with what Gloria and ClarLynda said. I think more and more we're seeing that people without undergraduate degrees can actually be effective at their jobs. And in fact, as part of my role at Microsoft, I've partnered with this program, which is a partnership with the state of Washington to bring in talent from diverse pipelines, and specifically people who actually just went to a coding academy, didn't study software engineering or computer science, and they do a sort of an internship at Microsoft, and then they get an opportunity to apply for a position. And I think that's definitely a path, right? And I've seen people been successful that way, and I personally have sponsored 2 of those candidates, right? So I don't think necessarily college education is required for a job anymore, as long as you can show that you have the capabilities, like the skills and the knowledge, right, to succeed.
Yeah, I'd like to just pipe in for a minute. Thank you for everything that you shared and for the question. I would say that I absolutely agree that we're at a time when, excuse me, that degrees are not necessarily required. Pardon me. But we're also seeing something else happening on the horizon. And what that is in recognition that education is not just limited to formal education. We have non-formal education and informal education, and that can be encompassing of lived experiences as well. And education itself is an institution. So it doesn't always work in favor of marginalized groups. So how do we, as companies and employers, recognize that a lot of underrepresented communities may come with a range of different types of education that they've experienced throughout their lifetime or generationally? And how do we, really honor that and say, this is something that we want to hire for and further recruit for? So I think that that's something that I'm seeing more of, which is just defining education as more holistic. And it's not just something that you get via degree or a diploma or something that happens in a formal institution, but something that happens throughout your life, and also recognition of non-linear paths. I myself have followed a very non-linear career path, and it's just interesting where I've ended up working at Amazon now, given that my path was not linear at all. So I think that it's an opportunity to have more conversations around this, and for employers to build relationships with communities and see what we're actually defining as education to begin with.
Thank you, Dia. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this question. And as an academic, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of promote the value of a liberal arts education, although this is, not really what I'm here for. But I think it's important to remember that as much as we have some alternative ways of acquiring skills, I think a liberal arts education is still a pretty good way of acquiring critical thinking skills, but also because it makes students coachable, very trainable, and perhaps ready to adapt to various environments and take on various learning processes, because I think it's a good place for them to learn how to learn and then to be able to take on various responsibilities. But I also see the value in boot camps, in other alternative ways of acquiring skills and being able to integrate a team in a corporate setting. So thank you very much for your question. And this question from Paul actually has a second question, which is still tied to the education question. And the question that has to do with, Paul says, in a context like higher ed, where there is an inherent power dynamic, how do administrators, faculty, and staff best deal with privilege? And how would that look in terms of policy, pedagogy, and community? So I would love to hear from everyone on this, and especially from folks who are in education. So it's very hard to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion without really talking about power and privilege, right? So I think Paul is really getting us into talking about something we would have talked about anyway. But I like the way this is phrased in the context of higher education. And I'm wondering what someone like Michael or ClarLynda, but everyone, but especially you too, what you think about this concern.
So I've talked a lot, so I'm curious to, ClarLynda, if you wouldn't mind going first, I'd appreciate it. And not just because it's a tough question.
I think it's a very difficult question, but I think one of the ways that particularly administration can play a significant role in dealing with privilege is really taking an objective viewpoint on grading, an objective viewpoint on what a class is, on what of how students get credit. So thinking about lifelong learners, right? So if you have a person who comes in perhaps from the armed forces, they've been through several different classes, which is traditionally a path that underrepresented minorities take to get to college. And so if we take that into account when we're giving credit, when we take that into account when we grade, so that we're very objective with a rubric and not so subjective to our unbiased conscious when we go through this journey, I think that that's the way that we start to combat privilege, because your unconscious bias does not drive the grade that a student gets in a class. We take into account their background and we give them credit so that they're able to progress at the same pace as someone else who's able to just go to school without having to work while they're in school. So all of those things to really balance the power are things that the administration can do. the faculty can take onus and say that they can admit to their unbiased conscience, and that they can have a second person to come in and actually help with the grading process. They can have someone else come in and really think about the way that they have their course structured. As we think about how we've shifted to online learning, one of the things that some of the professors decided to do was to take off points if a student doesn't turn their camera on. That is a real point of privilege, because you don't know where that student is. You don't know what their background is like. You don't know what their struggles are to just get onto the class. We really have to think about those things. And most of us who have gone through, or many of us who have gone through academia, gotten a PhD, then we come back and we decide to teach, we often forget where we came from. And so we look at everything from the lens of where we are right now and not necessarily where we came from. So I think the faculty can do that as well. I think the staff, by and large, coming from the private university side, do a great job of bridging the gap between where our students are right now and where we'd like for them to be. And so I think there are many things on many levels that can be done here. Pedagogy, it's so important to take this into account, that there are multiple perspectives and multiple views on each of the topics that we present, and being willing to have that openness really takes away our point of privilege and gives the students the voice. And so, very difficult question, but I think that's sort of my perspective about how we move forward. But on multiple levels, we have to take responsibility for removing privilege and thinking outside the box about how we do that.
I really appreciate that. One thing I would add, when you talk about forgetting where we came from, right? It makes me think of the point we made earlier about this. What does it look like to work in an organization that truly encourages you to bring your whole self in? Your history, your lived experiences, all of that as well. So that when we have conversations, I've been on search processes where it's pretty clear that we have an assumption that the candidates can all equally afford to fly themselves to the institution, and then we'll reimburse you. If we're going to pay for it anyway, why don't we just pay for it? Why make the assumption that you're going to come out of pocket and for the hotel and everything, and then submit a reimbursement? There's some decisions that we can make. And I've been in some conversations where it's pretty clear no one else has had that lived experience, or they're doing a really good job of appearing as if they have not, where money was an issue. And I try to be really open that was not always my lived experience. And so being able to fold those in conversations, I think those are also the ways that we can start to address it, because then policies you start to question, right? Because you have people in the room, in the conversation, who now are in a position to start to change those policies, because they can speak directly to the impact of how some things are set up, and and the assumptions that we've made along the way.
Thank you both for tackling this difficult question. Before we move ahead to other questions, I just want to go back to the comments about the value of the degree, of an undergraduate degree these days, and wondering if some of the panelists would like to qualify perhaps, or maybe clarify whether or not the non-degree requirement for these jobs is specifically related to the tech fields, whether that's true specifically for those fields, or if this is some sort of a general trend that they're sort of talking about.
I mean, there's going to be some places where you're going to have a degree. Like there's no way you're going to get a teacher certification without a degree, or become a doctor without having a degree. So there is some sense in that part where a degree still follows that traditional model. In tech, they're moving away from having the degree, and it's not just the software engineering side of it, but it's multiple aspects of it. And I think that when you start to look at that and how much it's going towards tech, or towards certifications or something else that you can do, it's not really about having a degree, but more about having a growth mindset, and having a capability to grow and to learn. And so, for someone who does have a degree, or, does have a degree, but it's not in the field, it's what additionally do you do that made you think that this would be a great role for you? For those who don't have a degree, sometimes it means, taking Coursera courses or showing a portfolio and things of that nature. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think that as tech continues to take over the majority of different industries, you'll see that a requirement for a degree is going to shift from being an important contribution to other things that were whole holistically. That being said, there are still things within like a college experience that I look for when I'm looking for a candidate that tells me something that you can get either at college or in traditional routes. But a lot of that is like, did you study abroad? Have you ever been to a different spot where you had to understand what it means to be a global citizen? Have you, ever had to, think outside of the box in different ways? Have you ever shown leadership in different ways? And sometimes that's reflective of the courses or the contents in which you did school, but sometimes it's stuff that you did at home, whether it's doing the key clubs or doing, traveling on mission trips and things of that nature. So I don't think that the only model is still this pedigree model of like, you went to the right schools and this degree is important. I think now they're looking at skill set and looking at soft skills as well, and looking at a more holistic model of who they're bringing on board.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that as we think about reshaping higher education, that siloed education is no longer as valuable as a liberal arts education, even if you're not at a liberal arts institution. So take, for example, the data science program that we had. That data science program requires you to have 18 hours within the major of application of data science to another area. It could be social justice, it could be political science, it could be history, it could be chemistry, biology, whatever. But what that allows our students to come out with is some real experience. And so on the other side of that, they don't have a siloed education. They're not just a data scientist, but they're a data scientist with very specific experience that speaks to their passion. So if we're going to charge what higher education costs, they have to come out of that experience with more than just a traditional education. It really has to be outside the silos, really come up with innovative programs that allow students to be better trained so that they can apply for a multitude of positions versus one position that just qualifies them by their discipline.
Thank you all for thinking about this question. Yeah, especially what you're talking about here in terms of access, but also the changing needs for companies, but also what they're looking for in students, in graduates and employees. As we think about this, I'm looking at a question from Jojo, and the question is, as we transition into a time where the undergraduate degree may not be as high of a value in some fields, what needs to be done to increase diversity and representation, especially with jobs and companies that have biases towards hiring more minorities in these roles?
Interesting. It feels, please go ahead, Gloria.
Yeah, so, I, for a long time, was in charge of hiring at Squares for their new grads and their interns. And we took a big shift from being like 33% women to 66% women and 5% minorities to 15% minorities. And one of the things that we actually walked away from was like, we walked away from career fairs, and we walked towards, a hackathon model or seeing people. We walked away from like having the major directly corresponding to roles, so like requiring CS degrees, to just removing that requirement altogether. And I think a lot of the times when we start to look at, from a company perspective, how do we deal with marginalized groups, it's going to where the marginalized groups are and seeing what we can bring to them. And so for a while, when I was dealing with groups, they just didn't know what a software engineering interview even looks like. And it's different from a traditional interview where you just show up with a suit and tie. And it was bringing that knowledge back to the HBCUs so that they could go anywhere and feel like they were best prepared. And I think that the best way for organizations to really make this shift is to move away from like just trying to get everyone who went to an Ivy League school, and to bring this knowledge out to general communities and say, okay, this is how you do this. So the knowledge sharing piece of it needs to go back to all different types of groups. And then there's an aspect of mentorship, of bringing in the mentors that can come back into marginalized communities and be mentors, especially if they're people that are also identified from those communities and have a skill set or something that they can contribute back to the communities that they came from. Because it's best if people see people who look like them or come from that same type of thinking to show this is where you can go and this is how you do it. When you think about privileged groups had, a group that they've all come together, they were the same, and then they had referrals to the great companies, and their privilege continues to amplify. And we need to empower the marginalized groups to also be able to amplify their perspective, their understanding, and bring that to the table as an asset, as a value add, and not as a cultural fit, but actually a cultural added to these organizations. And I think the more that organizations will see that people with diverse perspectives bring culture and it's an added bonus to their organizations, the more the partnerships can grow.
Thank you all so much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I want to thank the participants for sending their questions. We would love to answer all of the questions, but we are running out of time. I want to thank you all. I want to thank all the panelists, Dia, Michael, Arturo, ClarLynda, and Gloria. The SPU community thanks you for your sharing, for your time. We are very grateful that you actually came here today to share your wisdom with us and to inspire us to continue to engage in these conversations. I also would like to thank our events team, Dr. Radine Copeland, Micah, Madison, Taylor. I would like to invite everyone to join us tomorrow at 9:20 a.m. for former presidential candidate Andrew Yang's keynote address on the future of work, as well as the panel discussion that will follow. That's tomorrow, Friday at 9:20 a.m. Thank you all so much for participating in our conversation today. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you
So much.